Highness, thank you for that speech. It was a great pleasure to listen to, and I think, I feel especially honored because there are hundreds of people here who would like to be asking you questions this afternoon, and I'm the person who is sort of appointed to do so, and I'm delighted and deeply honored.
Thank you very much.
You ended with what is a remarkable theological foundation of pluralism.
Yes.
You began with the political situation of the world and the multicultural situation of the Ismailis. So from all standards, you have a basis for underlining pluralism as one of the most important issues in our world.
Yes.
But I think the theological understanding is one that may be new to many people who think primarily in terms of the practical issues of day-to-day life.
Right, right. Well, I think that's absolutely correct. And in fact, this notion of one humanity in the faith of Islam is a very, very powerful force. But it's not always presented in the form that I tried to present it today.
Yes.
And it is there, it is clear for those who wish to see it and understand it, but not all Muslim societies take that on board.
Well, it's interesting because Jewish, Christian, and Muslim societies all are founded on theological principles that stress the oneness of God, and also that begin with the theology of creation in the way in which you have. So there should be, and I think there has been, a kind of theological reaching out, I think especially of the Amman Declaration that you were part of, and of the message that was delivered called A Common Word between us and you from so many Muslim leaders to Christian leaders across the country.
I hope that is true. I have been watching in what parts of the world that has become a thought process. I am fearful of the parts of the world where that is not part of, let's say, government philosophy. But I think that in time, this understanding of the unity of human society will end up by being seen as a condition sine qua non of good governance. I think you will see governments fail because they do not practice this principle. They will have so many divisions within them, so many attempts at achieving positions of power by certain groups or influenced by others, that it will be impossible to create a sense of nationhood, a sense of building around common values, which after all is what most governments would wish to have.
I think one of the most striking things about the writings you've done on these issues and speeches like we've heard today is your relentless linking of issues of poverty and education and human development with the foundation of pluralism, as you've just articulated.
Well, if you try to analyze the causes of poverty in the developing world, as we have tried, there is absolutely no doubt that the marginalization of communities is one of the fundamental causes of this poverty. And this marginalization is so structured in society that minorities find it very difficult to break out of that situation. And the work that you are doing here in your field of pluralism, teaching about pluralism, having people understand that it's not a threat, on the contrary, it's a foundation of civil society in the modern world. These things, I think, are absolutely essential. I think the more we've seen societies which are fractured, putting little groups of people in another box, that is a a way of guaranteeing conflict and poverty.
One of the
Absolutely.
things I think that we take from this is because your Center for Global Pluralism really looks at global issues, which are so important, it also is the case that so much has changed in the United States and indeed in Canada
Right.
and indeed at Harvard
Right.
since the days you were
Right.
in Leverett House with two secretaries. And that is the tremendous movement of people as migrants, as refugees
Yes.
from one part of the world to another.
Yes.
And in the U.S., with the 1965 Immigration and Nationalities Act,
Right.
the opening of the U.S. to immigrants really from all over the world. So that's really changed the face of Harvard.
Right.
And the message that you bring is one that is very relevant to universities today.
Right.
I'm not sure how large the Harvard Islamic Society was when you were here.
Well, in fact, it didn't exist, I think, until Sir Hamilton Gibb came to teach here at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
My recollection is that he was the Jewett Professor of Islamic Studies at Oxford, if I'm not wrong. And he came to Harvard from Oxford, and he started the program here at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my recollection. That's a long time ago.
But you know, the thing that's amazing today, as you would walk around Harvard, you would see dozens and dozens of women going just from here to Leverett House in wearing hijab. That you would find a very active Islamic prayer space just next door in one of the floors of the freshman dormitory, and some places where the Jummah prayers every week
Right.
are in the largest lecture halls where they can remove all the chairs. So the transformation of our university from being a rather parochial university
Right.
in some ways
Right.
to a global and cosmopolitan university is something that has not only to do with the fact that people come here from all over the world,
Right.
but that our own nation has changed so
Right.
much. And these issues of marginalization that you speak of,
Right.
that are divisive in so many ways,
Right.
are issues that America faces profoundly
Right.
in dealing with race and culture, and indeed with a multi-religious society.
Right. Well, I'm deeply pleased that Harvard is moving towards what Harvard wanted to be even when I graduated. And I remember President Bok telling me extensively about how he was seeing Harvard becoming a global university rather than a US university. That was, in his mind at the time, a goal for this university. And what you are saying today is that that goal is in the process of being achieved.
Yes.
So I have to say, well, alhamdulillah, that's
Well, it's
wonderful.
been achieved, but we haven't really moved in some ways from what our current president, Drew Faust, called the necessity of moving from diversity
Right.
to belonging,
Right.
to a sense of really creation of a community that is respectful of
Right.
our differences, which are so many.
Right.
And that move, I think one of the profound things that I hear you say time and again is that pluralism doesn't just happen by itself.
No.
It requires a certain amount of conviction and support of institutions across the spectrum of civil society.
Well, I think that that's absolutely right, and indeed I would encourage education on pluralism even in secondary education. And in fact, neuroscientists are saying that newly born children recognize the pluralism of other children being next to them in a cot, even if they can't see the child.
Mm-hmm.
So the individual, the human individual, has extraordinary means of sensing somebody who is from a different society. But that sensing has nothing negative in it. It's what I would call a constatation. I can't find the word in English, but You know what I mean? So I find that very, very exciting, that when children are born, the notion of differences in background or race is not at all a feature which has value attached to it, neither negative nor positive. It's a constatation.
And that issue that you have raised again and again, that our differences are part of the richness that we bring to life.
Exactly.
We could say, from a theological standpoint, that's a God-given difference.
Yes.
From the scattering of people from this one soul.
Right. I have to nonetheless point out that many countries in the developing world where we have been working were governed on the principle of divide of communities. I mean, for years we worked in countries where the educational system was African, Asian, or European. There was no single educational system in those countries. And so that is a phenomenon which people have inherited even today, and which is difficult to overcome. I can remember situations where hospitals were not entitled to take people of different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. In the development network that you have created, right, spanning the world, I know education is a very big piece of this, from the Aga Khan universities to local education. That must be a daunting task. A few years ago, your daughter, Princess Zahra, was here and spoke at the Harvard School of Education about her role in this, with a great attention to women's education.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that's a particular emphasis that you bring, but it certainly is one that is profoundly important.
Yes. My grandfather, in fact, pushed very hard to have women's education as part of our overall educational process. So that's part of the way we think, the way we live today. And now you were talking about universities, etc. And it's clearly a critical issue that in the developing world, the universities should upgrade their performance, and that their degrees should be recognized, that their research should be of global importance. And I was taught when I came to Harvard that plagiarism was a bad thing. Well, I'm here to plagiarize. And I don't hide it from Harvard.
When you talk about the cosmopolitan ethic that emerges from this recognition of difference, right, and yet a foundation in human oneness, right, the elements of that are what exactly? What would you say are the elements of a cosmopolitan ethic?
Well, I think first of all, you need to accept the premise that human society is pluralist, and it has been pluralist for as long as we know about the human race, if I'm not wrong. So there is a basic premise that has to be accepted. Now that issue of accepting pluralism also means that you need to attach equity to that notion. If there is no equity in pluralist societies, then you don't have functioning pluralist societies, you don't have institutions that function properly, etc. And I have admired a number of governments in developing countries, for example, where without saying it, they have fought very hard to create equal opportunity for various communities in various parts of the country, whereas that was not the case in colonial societies. So
equity would be one element of that.
Equity would certainly be one element.
That ethic. And a respect for justice, is that another piece of it, or how?
Respect for justice, and I would say equal opportunity for the intelligentsia. Mm-hmm. I have seen situations where there has been an attempt to marginalize the intelligentsia of a given community. And that, of course, is an extremely unwelcome feature of a society.
One of the things I recall from having been involved with interfaith leaders, not that I'm one myself, but I'm an observer of these events, was the effort over a number of years ago to create a global ethic out of the distinctive ethical norms of different religious traditions and even of secular traditions. And there were certain things that everyone could agree on.
Yes.
And I think equality and justice and opportunity, dignity, etc., were very, very much agreeable. When it came to what equity meant, I hesitate to say that the biggest issue in equity among these dignified religious leaders was the issue of women and men, and whether gender equity, whether that really meant gender equity. And it seems to me, that is an issue to a great extent, and yet my own impression of the Ismaili community is that leadership in Jamaat Khanas and other elements of the development network and leadership in these positions is shared by women and men. Am I right about that? Or?
Absolutely, and in fact I spend considerable time trying to make sure that where there is leadership amongst women, the community could benefit from that. Leadership qualities is not gender driven. So actually, if you don't respect the fact that both genders have competences, outstanding capabilities, you are damaging your community by not appointing those people.
So as we think about, I'm thinking now about the kind of responsibility that you have, both for the spiritual as well as the material well-being. The welfare of the Ismaili community, but as you put it, it's not just the welfare of the Ismaili community, but those with whom they share their societies as well.
Absolutely.
So in those, are there societies in which you find it almost impossible to have the leadership of women in your own community rise?
No, not really. I think people tolerate our decisions. I'm not sure they're always welcome.
That seems to have struck a chord here.
I think the women in the audience know what I mean.
So as you think about your successor, is there any chance that Princess Zahra could, or would that not be tolerated?
No, that would not be tolerated.
We were very impressed with her here, though we haven't met your two sons, so.
Well, she's the first member of my family who's received a university degree. So she's an important member of my family because the gender balance is all now Harvard related.
Yes.
Not Radcliffe.
One of the things that has been so, I'm sure, very much on people's mind is that to intentionally cultivate pluralism in a society, there are some societies in which the civil society and our educational institutions are welcoming of this. But of course, pluralism within our own religious communities is often a very difficult thing. And I speak as a Christian who knows perfectly well the number of anti-pluralists there are within the Christian tradition, and people who are convinced that the only possible way of conceptualizing religious truth is through the lens of the Christian tradition. This also is probably true in the Muslim tradition, and the effort that must be made to cultivate a kind of appreciation of mutual respect and difference is certainly a huge task.
Well, I would strongly agree that pluralism is a subject that is taught. It's not instinctive in human society.
It's not
And
instinctive.
It's
yes.
not instinctive. So I would strongly support any initiative at any level of age, that is from the newly born child up to the postgraduate student, that there should be continuous exposure to the notion of pluralism in society. And it's much easier with children, obviously, than with grown-ups. But to me, it must be a feature of any modern society in any part of the world. I can't travel in any part of the world today without observing the amazing mix of backgrounds of people today that wasn't there years ago. And that's happening more and more through happy events, unhappy events. You can see what's happening with the refugees today. But I'm more worried about societies preparing themselves to accept foreigners. That's not a big story of success in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only country that I can think of that actually has a process is Canada.
Mm-hmm. And you've lived certainly in France,
Yes.
and have deep connections in England as well.
Right.
And you've seen the way in which they are struggling with the diversity of their own societies.
Absolutely, and for different reasons. But they're struggling, and in many ways, I consider them somewhat unprepared.
I think the preparedness here in the United States is also very marginal. I mean,
Yes.
the Pluralism Project has been studying
Yes.
the changing religious landscape of the U.S. for 25 years. Right. And I think along the lines of your point, if I had been teaching kindergarten in Houston, Texas, I would have realized far earlier
Right.
how much our society had been changing. But it wasn't until the 1990s that the children of this new immigration came to college and began transforming our own demographic and the university in which we live and teach.
Well, I think your point is very important, because what you're effectively saying is awareness in the United States of the issue.
Yes.
I'm thinking of countries where there hasn't been that awareness until much too late.
Yes. Well, and among some Americans as well, even though it's scarcely, you can't really find a state in the U.S. where the Muslim and Hindu and Sikh presence hasn't become a significant one. But still, I mean, we hear this in some of our public leaders, that this is only a slowly dawning awareness, and they sometimes don't like it as well.
Yes, I realize that. But I mean, I think these are people who are thinking against or in contradiction with a roadmap that you can extend from history, and you extend that roadmap and you reach the correct conclusions.
You've often said, and I think it's right, as we look at the world today, that the instability and divisiveness of societies is infectious.
Yes.
And at the same time, you say, so is hope.
Yes.
So can you give us, in conclusion, just a sense of the infectiousness of hope from your experience?
Yes. Well, I think I mentioned in my comments, to me, one of the most important issues for any society in any part of the world is that it should be driven by hope. The moment that people of any generation, of any age, lose hope, it is a very, very damaging thing for that community, that society. So creating circumstances of hope is, to me, very, very important indeed. And much of the Aga Khan Development Network, their work is to try to assist countries to become countries of opportunity. That is one of the main goals that I have, is that as many countries where the community is living should be countries of opportunity. The definition of opportunity, of course, is a different thing, but a life that sees itself with no opportunity is a very, very sad prospect.
Your Highness, this has been a great pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for your return to Harvard for this afternoon. Thank you very much, and may you come again and again.
Well, thank you for your generosity and your questions. Thank you.
Well, in conclusion, I want to thank everyone who's been involved in bringing His Highness to Harvard today, particularly the staff of the Weatherhead Center, who's been working very hard. And second, I want to thank Ali Hassani, who really is the pivotal person around which this activity has led us. And Diane Eck's probing and thoughtful question, which I think has really helped us think through much of the message that His Highness shared with us. And finally, and I can say that the message that we heard today is certainly giving all of us hope. We're going to continue this reflection. We're going to have in January a Harvard faculty conversation around many of the questions that were debated today. So I think that we are leaving this room enriched by the wisdom, and I thank again His Highness for sharing his thoughts, his profound thoughts. And I should say, as a Canadian, I'm absolutely delighted to hear all this.